United States Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for taking time from his very busy schedule to come here to make this presentation. I also want to thank his staff for being present today because I know they have been intricately involved in this particular issue. I'm pleased that so many of our senators were able to take time from their busy schedule to show up today for Senator Whitehouse's presentation. Even though this event is hours before our normal session, you made it a priority to be part of this opportunity to be informed about one of the most significant policy challenges I think we're going to be facing in the next year or two. At the state level, there's a great deal of anxiety about what's happening in Washington, especially some of the policies that are being introduced by our new president. Not only are our budgets being threatened, but essential supports and services to the people of our state are at risk. We need to be informed of what's being proposed and of the implications of those proposals. I'm grateful to the Senate Democratic Caucus Policy Committee for planning this event for us today. It's very timely, given the passage of the health care reform bill in the House of Representatives and the subsequent Congressional Budget Office scoring of that bill that took place last week. Now the legislation has moved to the U.S. Senate. Our senators are great champions for health care issues, and we know that they will strongly represent our state's interest in this important debate. I would like to introduce Senator Josh Miller, who's the Senate Democratic Caucus Policy Chairman, to introduce our guest and to moderate the discussion this afternoon. Senator Josh Miller.
Thank you, and on behalf of the Senate Democratic Policy Group, I want to welcome you all to this briefing. The other members of the policy group here today or we expect, I know that Senator DePalma is on a call, he'll be back in, and we expect Senator Golden, Senator Cindy Coyne also is a member of the group. We are pleased to have U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse here to help us understand the status of the health care legislation in Congress and the implications for our state. Senator Whitehouse is well known nationally for advocacy on the environment, but here in Rhode Island we know of his legacy and leadership in health care. As a former director of the Department of Business Regulation, he was our chief state insurance regulator. As a former Attorney General, he was our chief health care advocate, and in that role his office represented the public during hearings on pending health care rate increases. As our Attorney General, he initiated discussions with health insurers and providers, creating what is known as the Quality Institute, which has created our statewide medical record database. He pursued a vision for improving quality of health care in our state. We are grateful that Senator Whitehouse could fit this briefing into his schedule. He will begin with an overview of what has happened and is happening in Washington regarding the Affordable Care Act, and I find it amazing that we all agree to stick to that issue and that issue only in this, because we would love to hear the rest of the story on everything else, but that's our subject matter today. And he has agreed to follow that presentation with a question and answer period with the state senators who have joined us today. Also, I want to welcome the staff members who are here representing the rest of our congressional delegation, and I'm happy to introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. President, how nice it is to call somebody Mr. President and have it be Senator Ruggiero. So I think what would be best would be to move as rapidly as possible to your questions. But let me just give what I see as the political lay of the land in Washington. The House, under intense pressure from its leadership and from the White House, pushed through their House bill without anything resembling proper hearings and without much time for debate and without any amendment process through any kind of regular order. Those are awkward attributes of their legislation for them because they spent so much time blaming the Affordable Care Act for having those attributes. The difference was that the Affordable Care Act only had those attributes with respect to a few moments in its legislative travels, particularly when it came back from the House and we had to solve it through reconciliation and there was no chance for more hearings. But I sat on the Help Committee during the hearings on the Affordable Care Act, and we had weeks of hearings. We took dozens of amendments. I think we passed over 100 during the course of all of that. And we had about as robust and public a process as one could have on the section of the bill that was under the jurisdiction of the Help Committee. The Finance Committee had a similar process, a little less robust, I think, than ours, but still very public and with lots of room for discussion. So they got themselves in a little bit of a hole by behaving in the way they'd accused us wrongly of behaving. Then they passed it without CBO scoring it, the Congressional Budget Office. Now, you can disagree with the Congressional Budget Office's scoring of things, but you can't ignore it, because by rule, that's the score that it has to live by to meet pay-go and other types of parliamentary rules. So finding out after the fact that they'd made the brilliant move to go from 24 million people thrown off of health care insurance to now only 23 million thrown off of health care insurance has put them in a bit of a pickle, and the fact that they didn't know that going in is, again, awkward and embarrassing for them. So the Senate looks at the House and sees this mess. It sees a bill that had terrible process. It sees people who didn't know what they were doing. And we also remember, on the Senate side, the way the White House behaved on the House side. We know that in the early stages, they clearly didn't know what was in their bill and didn't know what they were talking about. They also took different groups into different rooms and told them different things about the bill, not realizing that those groups were going to check with each other afterwards. So not knowing what the bill is about and telling different people different stories about the bill is not a way to build up a lot of loyalty and credibility. Then they threw some of their own people under the bus for not being supportive enough, and that doesn't exactly build a sense of loyalty. And then clearly they don't know whether they're winning or losing, which in politics is a very difficult failure. So what the Senate's looking over at this process is a process by which people got led off a cliff that they didn't know was going to be anywhere near as steep as it was, being told a lot of stuff that proved to be false. And so before you even get to the substance of the bill, you have a process that has the Senate, the Republican senators, in a very high state of alarm and concern about the just general management of all of this and the fake facts and all of the rest. Then you look at the bill itself, and of course it's a nightmare, and it's particularly a nightmare for rural communities, so which often are very Republican communities. So what the Senate has, I think, concluded is that the House bill is dead, and they're going to look at two paths. The first path they're on right now, explore whether they can pull together a bill that will garner the support of 50 Republicans so they can jam it through under the reconciliation rules without having to get to 60 votes, which causes a number of problems. First, you've got to come up with a bill. They haven't done that yet. Second, you've got to get to 50 votes, and it's not the least bit clear that they can do that. And third, it's got to fit within the reconciliation rules, so that's not clear. So there's some real obstacles ahead in trying to jam through a partisan bill, setting aside the problem that if they jammed it through, it would probably be terrible. And they're going to have to own up to those consequences, not in the 18 elections and in the 20 elections. So there's a lot of caution. They've played a game of trying to sell the public a bill of goods about the Affordable Care Act and about how easy it was going to be to fix and how it was all going to be wonderful, and they painted themselves into a corner. And their problem is that a lot of the stuff they've been saying are easy solutions actually just plain don't work. They just don't work in real life. And so they're stuck between the inevitable collision of their rhetoric with the facts, and many of them are smart enough to know that their rhetoric varied from the facts. So for all those reasons, I think they're going to have a hard time on the Senate side going the 50-vote, one-party, jam-it-through route, which means that they have to do the thing that they accused us of never doing, again, wrongfully, but that is to revert to regular order and to say to the Finance Committee and to the Help Committee, okay, see what you can do. We'll have to try to pull a bill together that will get bipartisan votes. And there, I think, we have lots of room where we could do very good things in health care for the American people. One thing would be a public option. If there are areas where the exchanges are failing, let Medicare, CMS come in and put their own thing in place. They already operate in those states for Medicare. They already operate in those states for Medicaid. Just have them operate a separate plan and keep it actuarially sound and set them up to do it. That wouldn't be so hard. Another way would be to drop the Medicare eligibility for the country from 65 to 60, or to 55, or to 50. And when you do that, you make a lot of people happy who are now in Medicare, which for a lot of Americans looks like safe harbor after a long life of being jostled around in the healthcare system. Plus, the more expensive people, above 60 or above 55 or above 50, get pulled out of the competitive system, and so rates go down for everybody else. And, I think those are very strong possibilities. We also are doing great work here in Rhode Island. If you talk to Coastal Medical and if you talk to primary care physicians of Rhode Island, with the primary care ACOs, we are leading the country. They are seeing their cost per patient year over year go down. We're not talking about the cost of health care going up at a slower rate. We're talking about it actually coming down at the primary care provider level and in fairly significant measure. How do you support that so that more doctors can do that? How can you make winners out of people like Coastal Medical and primary care physicians who are at the front in the country rather than make them drag all the laggards and not get the full benefit of their effort? But that should be an easy thing for us to work on, and that should be a very good thing for us to work on. We have wonderful stuff that we could be doing about hospital-acquired infections, which remain a plague throughout the healthcare system, and we could support eliminating those in a whole variety of ways. The connection between opioids, behavioral health, and physical health is one where we could continue to make more progress. I say that as the author of the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, but there's still more that could be done there. So if you look at some of those things, end-of-life care would be another great area. You just may have seen the piece that Tim Babineau recently wrote, where he pointed out how very often it is that somebody is getting care that they don't want, that disrupts their expectations for how they wanted to die because they hadn't got themselves organized to make their wishes known first. Rhode Island is working very well on this, and I'm very pleased to say that the diocese has been a very useful, helpful ally in working on this, to the extent where they actually put the form for advance directives into a brochure that they hand out through the churches and parishes. So we're in a good place in Rhode Island to work on those, and I believe that Republicans can go home to their states and say, look, we couldn't do repeal Obamacare the way we wanted. The rules of the Senate got us all fouled up, but look what we did about making your doctors take better care of your health. Look what we did about making sure there weren't any hospital-acquired infections. Look what we did about supporting opioid treatment and making sure that people's health care is connected to their recovery treatment. Look what we did about fixing all these various areas, and I think they can go home into elections and say that's a win. So that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that the next step Mitch McConnell takes is away from the 50 vote, ram it through, use the reconciliation process, Republicans only voting for it path, and move to the 60 vote. It has to be bipartisan, open process, regular order, amendments, and all of that. Once that takes place, everything changes. So to the extent that you have outside groups you're associated with who are trying to push on this, to the extent you work for companies that are involved in this, whatever it is, that's the big push right now, to get Mitch McConnell to follow his own advice to do important things through regular order. So that's the political backdrop that we're in, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have, but I'm quite optimistic. Senator Metz.
After that passed the House, people almost think that it's over, and
it ain't over.
That's what I mean. That's why I'm glad to hear you. And when you came to
it didn't even really start.
And
we're
so
converting in the Senate.
And so now we just have to get the word out that that is not over. Don't give up hope, and to count on our elected officials in Congress and others that are supporting poor people and other people. Don't give up. It's not, the battle's not over. Let's keep fighting. And I think I'm glad you're doing this, because that's the message because what I'm hearing after it passed the House, everybody just said that's it. And I'm glad that you're telling us a little bit different. I just wanted to say that.
No, the House bill is dead in the Senate. Thank you, Susan. Yes, that is good news. Lou, Senator Palmer.
Senator, thank you for doing this. A few questions. I think the public option is a great option to be looking at, especially in those places where, whether it's Aetna that's pulled out, and we heard Paul Ryan and everyone else saying, look at that, there's no choices for people, that of ACA, so the public option is certainly something that would be worthwhile. But I'll say, over the backdrop of that, and you've talked about Medicare eligibility dropping from 65 to 60 to 55 to 50.
Yeah.
The other options with regard to the end of life care, the cost of running the primary care docs with ACOs. Given what's transpiring with I'll say the other party, the Republicans, and what's happening there, from a process perspective, what we hear, what we don't hear, nothing's happening. Basically, everybody's waiting for somebody to blink first. So in the absence of that, can you share with us, from the Democratic side of things, are the Democrats looking at putting these options forward? So in the case of going back to the CBO issue, you're right, they came out with the ACA and had no CBO score whatsoever. You couldn't find it.
Yeah.
And they said, don't worry about it, we've done it in the past. So everybody used all of the same reasons. But looking at the Medicare eligibility dropping and some of those other things, how can the Democrats get out in front of that, put a plan together, put those options together, get the CBO to score them, so that at the end of the day, when it comes down to the last minute and somebody says, well, you didn't think about this, you didn't think about that, from a Democratic perspective, we can have the leadership to say, we've thought about these 5 options, here they are, here's what the cost of them are, so people can't say or walk away from saying, it's too late, we got to get this done. So the question, can you talk about the process of what's happening behind the scenes that you can share?
The key conversation that's happening behind the scenes is one that I think many of you here will appreciate, who've been engaged in legislation for some time, which is the Democrats who are in these conversations to a person saying to the Republicans, look, we can talk, but don't you think that you're going to peel off 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 of us. That's not going to happen. We are a united caucus on this, and you are not going to shave away a few Democrats and get your stupid bill done. So that, I think, is really important, because that forces the choice on McConnell. Do I jam this through with 50, and then there are no sweeteners that he can put on that we have given our blessing to, that makes it awkward for people who've been the proponents of that particular thing, to suddenly have it thrown on in bad faith by them to try to put them in a bad position or force them to jump over and support the bill. So we are really holding our powder on this. A lot of this work has been done. I mean, I was the author of the public option bill when we did Obamacare, so that's pretty easy to pull off the shelf and dust off. And I don't think time is as much our enemy as it is theirs. So I think we feel pretty comfortable that we don't need CBO scoring in the same time frame that they do, and that the time to roll out an alternative is once McConnell has made the fateful decision that he's going to send this to committees and follow regular order. And at that point, then we can roll out, here's what we want to do, and start looking for Republican support for those ideas. And also, frankly, start looking for White House support for those ideas, because President Trump is a totally different dude than candidate Trump when it comes to so many issues, and this is one of them. And if we can recall him to some of his populist support Medicare, support Medicaid, single payer makes sense. You remember saying to the Australian, your system is so much better than ours? Yeah, because it's simpler. So that's the opportunity, I think. And until then, we really want to, I think, hold our powder and wait till we see the whites of their eyes, I guess, to use another one. And then I think they have no choice but to blink. Yes, sorry.
More of a practical question. If I recall correctly, the version that never came out of the House originally had a date of implementation about 2020. If and or when this bill were to come out, do you know when it would actually be applied? The reason I'm asking is the implication that it has to state budgets. You know, will we have any lag time to be dealing with that?
I think the House bill kicked in after the 18 elections. They wanted to make sure they got through this without people actually feeling the sting of what they were passing, and they could try to sell it before it was having effect. If I remember, I mean, there are different elements to it, but I think the major pieces kicked in 2019 and thereafter. And we haven't seen anything out of the Senate side that would have any shape, let alone any date. So I think they're going to want to push it out as much as they can to avoid being held accountable for the immediate harm that it would do. The problem is that some of the stuff that they do is so dumb that it really starts to hurt people now. So if you're a hospital in a rural area and you're hanging on by your fingernails, and you've been supported by the fact that there's a huge Medicaid lift in your state and a huge lift of people funded by Obamacare through the exchanges, so you're getting paid for stuff, you start to pull down Medicaid, particularly on the schedule they're looking at, $1.4 trillion over 10 years, then I don't think the states are going to pony up $1.4 trillion. So the hospitals looking around each other and saying, what does this mean for me? This means I'm not going to get paid. This means my uncompensated care is going to go through the roof. And they have to look out years ahead. And if what they're looking out at years ahead is an untenable situation, they've got to start hiring the bankruptcy lawyers now. They've got to start planning those strategies now. So that's part of the reason why the blowback against this bill from the Hospital Association, the Medical Association, the Health Insurers Association, all of them has been so strong, because they will probably be the first ones who have to take into account those effects and begin to face them ahead of the regular public.
Thank you.
Yeah. By the way, we did a public option here in Rhode Island, if you'll recall, when a market collapsed. When the workers' compensation market collapsed and every single insurer left the state, we stood up Beacon. And it did a good job until the market could recover and people could look and say, hey, that's a healthy market, and they came roaring back in. So we have some experience with public options.
Following up on Senator Picard's, the implications are to all 50 states on a Medicaid cutback. The most important states politically, I would assume, would be those states that have either Republican governors or Republican senators, and
took the Medicaid waiver.
And how much pushback?
Or Medicaid expansion, I should say.
Yeah, took the Medicaid expansion. So how much pushback and how much conversation is going on between those governors and those senators in those states that is realistic to what the implications are to state budgets? And as you said, in rural counties, it's county budgets in states that have county budgets, because if it's Rhode Island doesn't have this, but a lot of other states do, where a hospital is owned by either a municipality or a county.
Yeah.
And so this has serious implications not only on state budgets in many of these states that have those that took that expansion.
No, they're getting a lot of pushback. And even in the states where they didn't do the expansion, the cuts and block granting that's being proposed for Medicaid generally has a lot of these people alarmed. I think a lot of colleagues on the Republican side have had a new appreciation of what Medicaid actually is. I think many of them thought that it was basically an urban support program for poor people, primarily of color, who live in cities and who aren't their rural people. They don't know that 60% of the nursing home payments in the country come through Medicaid. It's their aunt in the nursing home whose Medicaid is paying for that. A lot of the opioid treatment that people are getting in states like West Virginia and Ohio that have been slaughtered, as we have, by the opioids epidemic, they're getting picked up through Medicaid. And so there's a lot of anxiety generally about the proposed cuts to Medicaid, and it's even sharper in those areas where the governors are starting to holler and say, wait a minute, I'm going to have to run a deficit, I'm going to have to do a tax increase, what are you going to make me do in all of this, just because you guys are making a mess of this.
So also, with that, have there been states, or has there been a discussion about interstate insurance? So
they talk about it, but it's so, it's so dumb that most people who
think about it
at all realize that it's no place to go.
Yeah.
If you are selling insurance, against a rock falling on your house, and anybody can fix the house when the rock comes, and the only job that the insurer has is to send a check, then you can do that kind of around the country. With health insurance, you need to have a network. You need to have, as you know well, you need to have the providers who work with you. You need to have the billing stuff. You need to have your computer systems in place. You need to have the electronic health records stood up in a way that you have to come in and integrate your program into that state's healthcare service network in a really robust way. You can't just mail it in from Arkansas, and when you drive by the telephone poles and see the signs stapled to them saying, get health insurance cheap, I can tell you as the former insurance regulator, you can bet that you're going to be conned by that. There's a reason that advertisement is being nailed up to a telephone pole. Real health insurance requires a real network of real doctors who've agreed on stuff, know how to make referrals, and can engage with the healthcare system. And so of all the places in which cross-state insurance it's usually a marginal idea. In healthcare, it's got no good sense behind it at all.
Getting to the conversation of real health insurance versus what is being promoted as part of the House version, where you would take away essential benefits and allow for interstate and all these. We now have an effort in Rhode Island where we have legislation sponsored by the Caucus that would say that in Rhode Island we would preserve essential benefits.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an effort that maybe should be considered beyond Rhode Island? We have the backing of all our major insurance companies based on the instability that is now in the market.
Yeah.
It doesn't even allow them to predict what their policy expenses are next year.
For the sake,
based on that stability, they're very interested in this type of legislation. It could be motivation that helps the federal conversation.
For the sake of any particular state, I think it's probably a good idea. Certainly it's good for the citizens of the state to know what their essential benefits are, and to have them there, and to know that they're going to be there when they need them. And whatever the essential benefits are, insurers get pretty good about pricing them. So, if you have to have maternity care as an essential benefit, the single guy's policy is not going to be priced based on that, because they'll know better than to do that. So, I think it's generally a good thing. The danger is that if a lot of states do it, then the federal Congress says, oh, okay, the states have got that, so we can cut the strings on that and have there be no essential federal health benefit. And then you risk having there be kind of a downward, slow motion death spiral as states one by one cut stuff out in order to move those expensive people to other states. That's what you'd like to avoid. I should mention, by the way, that when you're talking about savings in healthcare, there are two things. I didn't bring up my favorite graphic, but there's a chart that I use a lot, and the up and down y-axis is how long people live in that country, and the x-axis is how much they spend per capita on healthcare in that country. And basically, everybody is here. Everybody that we compete with is in a blob here. And the United States is alone out here. We are 50% more expensive per capita than the least efficient economic competitor that we have. And if you take the average, we're about 100% more expensive. And then when you draw the line across back to life expectancy, we're competing with Croatia and Greece. And we're behind all of our major economic competitors. We're behind France, England, Germany, so on, Australia, you name it. So we are spending a lot of money for, at least by the metric of life expectancy, not much return. And you look at other returns like maternal health, women who die in childbirth, children who die in childbirth, things like that. It's not good. So that's the bad news. The good news is that means there's an enormous amount of money to be saved by improving the way in which we deliver health care. And that needs to be our target. And if we can keep our eye on that ball, there's an enormous amount of savings. Just one element of this is that when I got to the Senate, the CMS, CMS, they look from a particular period, they take a year and then they run a 10-year period, and they try to figure out how much money is going to be spent in that 10-year period for the federal health care programs. Before the Affordable Care Act, that was at X, some enormous colossal number. After the Affordable Care Act passed, CMS went back and redid the calculation based on 1 year of experience, if I'm not mistaken, under the Affordable Care Act, and changes that the Affordable Care Act wrought. And they redrew the line for those 10 years. And the difference over those 10 years was $3.3 trillion saved. So when people say we need to save money in health care, folks, you did. You saved about $3.3 trillion. Now, some of it isn't going to be purely the Affordable Care Act, but nobody's been able to look at anything else and find out a factor to which it can be attributed. We're past the economic meltdown. It's clearly not that. That's been discounted as a major factor anyway, maybe a partial factor. Something is going on in delivery system reform that we're starting to see those numbers come down, and I think it's coastal medical and primary care physicians and people like them all across the country who are focusing on that delivery system reform piece and actually bringing costs down, whether it's Kaiser or Geisinger or Gunderson Lutheran, you know, the big systems around the country who are best in class at this, or whether it's local practices like ours who are driving it. So you really want to go back before undo that potential save? Now, that's all predicted. We'll see how it comes out. But if somebody were projecting $3.3 trillion in additional cost for this, you can bet we'd be hearing about that every day from Fox News. And instead, they're predicting $3.3 trillion in savings over 10 years. That's a pretty big number, even by Washington standards. Yeah, Lou.
From a more tactical perspective, what's the timeline? What could we expect? Will this be worked on when, and when would you think it's going to start?
They're being really, really, really quiet about this. Everybody in that little 13 white man study group has been told to shut up and, not leak stuff out. But what's coming out of it is Mitch McConnell saying, I still don't see a way to 50. So the big moment in the Senate calendar is the August recess. We take off, they closed in the middle of July for the August recess last year. I don't know how, they may be as eager to get the hell out and away from Trump and home to their districts now as then. But before we take that break, because we don't come back until early September, before we take that break, I think McConnell probably has to have made up his mind. I think it would be hard to leave all of his people hanging out over that 6, 7, 8 week period, whatever it ends up being, with no decision made on this. Maybe it's a smart idea, but I don't really see how. I don't think it is. So I think he has to have made the go, no-go decision on whether he throws in the towel on the 50 reconciliation, jam it through Republicans only path, or the other path. And if he makes the decision before then, then the committee staff, who don't go home, have that period to start teeing up ideas and negotiating and talking to each other, so that when people do come back, there's some kind of ground rules in place, and you can get to hearings, and you can start moving things on, and people know where everybody is. And the staff process can be accelerate our work by putting it into that window. So my gut is that he'll have to have made the decision by the time we leave for the August recess. And he may make it sooner.
Yeah, I was just wondering, aside from this legislative process, if any national strategy has been devised to counter Trump's threats to just kill the ACA by administrative measures.
It's hard to do because obviously once you're dealing with administrative measures, they have kind of full control. I am told that there are groups who are watching this very carefully so that they can use the Administrative Procedures Act processes, make sure that no liberties are taken, that there's a lot of transparency, that voices are heard. It's not very often that an administrative agency can do something without triggering the Administrative Procedures Act, anything significant. There are some ways, but it's not that easy. So to have watchmen on the ramparts to defend and make sure they're following proper procedure, because transparency is our friend in most of this stuff, and legal accountability is our friend in most of this stuff. So being ready for that matters. And the second thing is internally in the Senate, I think there's a lot of doubt on the part of our Republican colleagues that they're going to be able to walk away from the meltdown of some Obamacare markets without being assigned any blame for it. Not when you control both the White House and Congress and CMS. I mean, really? Outside forces made you do it? Good luck with that. Now, they'll try. That it was inevitable, that they're the death spiral. They tried to hold it off. They were the heroes. We stopped them, and now it imploded. That's going to be their narrative, and we're going to have to work very hard at a competing narrative. The other thing is, if that were to happen, I think that puts us in a very strong footing to begin to do what Lou said and say, okay, here's our solution now. Medicare at 50. Try that on for size. And see how their voters like being told by the Republicans in the House and the Senate, no, you can't have Medicare. That's only for people over 65. We're not going to give you that. Medicare is kind of golden to people. So I don't want them to fail so that we get into that bargaining position, but I do think that if they do force a failure, which they're very capable of doing, it doesn't necessarily put them into a good bargaining position. And they're not good at this stuff. They don't know what they're doing. And they all fight with each other publicly and disagree with each other. I mean, it's kind of a gong show. It solves a ton of their problems. First of all, it lights up the market because premiums for younger people go down a lot when they don't have to carry anybody over 50. So suddenly that whole change, I mean, that's just an illumination of that market. And then they don't have to face those 50 to 65-year-olds who exactly are the ones who, by taking a 3-band system and turning to a 5-band system, you have them having their rates jacked by multiple 100%. And they'll own that. So it's actually quite a good solution for their worst problems, which makes it even more awkward for them. So there's going to be, I guess I'd conclude, since I don't see any other questions, by saying that although the House bill is terrible, and although the House process was terrible, the likelihood of the Senate matching that in terms of terrible process and a terrible bill is very, very small. The likelihood, I think, is that the Senate will try to redeem itself by doing something bipartisan and sensible in this space. And if they make that choice, there's plenty to do. And if things do go badly, I think it's important for us to quote Bruce Sunderland, when you have a disability, make use of it. Seek advantage in those difficulties to try to get this problem solved for people. And I think we're in a strong position to do it. I think Nancy Pelosi is leading a disciplined and thoughtful House effort that does not have a lot of defection or quarrel in it. And I know that Senator Schumer is leading a thoughtful and cohesive Senate Democratic effort that does not have a lot of quarreling or dissension in it. So we have a lot of strength. And in the same way that the Trump budget got exactly no place, and the House and the Senate, under Republican leadership, decided they were going to completely ignore the Trump budget and simply work out a deal with us, knowing that we kind of had the whip hand, because if the shutdown came, it was going to be on their necks, and we did not make unreasonable demands. We basically said, look, level funding, and none of your weird poison pill stuff. Just keep that stuff out. And we got that. We got essentially everything we wanted. Trump got exactly nothing that he wanted out of that last process. So there is a strong tenor emerging in Congress that we will do these things, bipartisan and bicameral, and just sideline Trump and his people because they're not trustworthy, not helpful, not knowledgeable, and I mean, that's not me saying that, that's what the Republicans feel about him. So there's a we are not in a bad bargaining position. If you look at politics as a field of battle, we are in good ranks, in good morale, in good field position, and they are mostly fighting with each other in the swamps and don't know what's going on very well and haven't been able to get themselves organized to do really anything yet. So do not be faint of heart is the conclusion I ask you to draw from all of this. We will work very, very hard to have your back, and we have, I think, the facts and the principles of economics and the principles of insurance all on our side, and I think we can fairly start thinking about what's the really good outcome here, not just how do we fend off the worst of the bad outcomes. So with that thought, I leave you. Thank you.